Thank you, everybody, for joining the February Journal Club of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. I'm going to turn it over to Dio to talk about the article he recently got published with Tom Archibald. And feel free to type in any comments or questions to chat, or when appropriate, unmute yourself and have a merry old time.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oladayo Omosa, and I'm currently an evaluation fellow at CDC. But this publication, this research was done before I joined CDC. So it was basically one of the things I did with respect to my research, the dissertation research, obtaining my PhD at Virginia Tech. So it was published in conjunction with my advisor, Thomas Archibald, who is an associate professor at Virginia Tech. I just want to double check to be sure you are all hearing me. 1 second. Can you all hear me? Okay, perfect. So I can see someone type that you can hear me, so I will continue. So it's the title of the article is Towards Defining and Advancing Made in Africa Evaluation, and it was published in edition of Evaluation Matters, which is the publication of IDEF, International Development Evaluation of African Development Bank. So the central idea of this publication has to do with putting what I will summarize as putting the right peg, or the round peg rather, in the right round hole, square peg in the round hole. In other words, we must make sure that evaluation is contextually relevant and culturally responsive. So before I delve into this research, African evaluation landscape as a whole has been trying to make sure that evaluation done on the continent, it's responsive to the needs of the continent. In other words, it's aligned with their culture, with their history, with their traditions, and their lifestyle as a whole. Even though Africa as a continent has a lot of diversity. In other words, we have plurality of culture, of languages, of tradition, but there's still common threads, that is woven through the fabric of the African continent. In other words, we share some basic values, we share some basic tenets, we share some basic tradition. For example, in Africa as a whole, we value hierarchical system more than egalitarian system. And by that, I mean that, we try to believe that we have superior in every ladder. There's only somebody to report to. We don't really see that everyone is equal, but we see that there's hierarchy in the system. So these are some of the tenets that are woven through the fabric of the African system. So in order to make sure that African evaluation is consistent with African tradition, there's this idea of, or the concept called Made in Africa evaluation. So thought leaders in African evaluation contests begin to come up with the idea of Made in Africa evaluation. And this essentially talks about making sure that evaluation done on the African continent aligns with the African culture and system. In other words, for example, in the Western parts where most of us are, we talk about the gold standard, the RCT, randomized control trial. Um, can we go to Africa and use the same approach to evaluation? Well, that will work on in some certain contexts, but in some other contexts that might not be important. So we just want to make sure that evaluation in Africa is consistent with the culture of the people. So there's this idea called Made in Africa evaluation. It's almost becoming a buzzword without no proper definition. It's not it's not grounded in literature. There's no foundation for it in literature. So I set out, and my advisor then, to properly position this concept to make sure that it's not becoming a buzzword. So even though the African thought leaders in evaluation wanted to make sure that the evaluation aligns with the culture of the people, but it's not, coming up with the concept of the Made in Africa evaluation, but this concept is not properly grounded in literature. So I set out to correct these and make sure that we have a proper definition of the concept. So basically, this research, has three research questions. Number one is to see how thought leaders in African evaluation define Made in Africa evaluation, how are MAE principles operationalized and presented in evaluation reports, and what next steps do African evaluation thought leaders prioritize to further advance the MAE concept. But before I delve deeper into these research questions, I would like to say, prior to my research, um, a popular and notable evaluation evaluator in Africa called in the person of Bagali Chiliza started positioning this concept, but her research failed to come up with a definition of Made in Africa evaluation. So research became a good foundation for me to build upon, and which I did. So I kind of stood on Chiliza's shoulder, taking up the starting up where she stopped. In other words, she had tried to describe the concept, but she didn't define the concept. She, put the concept to light in African evaluation landscape, describing it and trying to position it, but without a clear and grounded definition. So I must say this to continue that at this point. So for what are the methods used to address this research question? The first one that talks about how do African evaluation leaders define Made in Africa evaluation. I used a DEFI techniques. I used the DEFI techniques and the semi-structured interview to address this. For the second research question that talks about how thought leaders, how the MAE concept is operationalized in evaluation reports, I use document analysis and concept mapping. And for the third research question that talks about the next steps that African evaluation thought leader prioritize, I used survey and semi-structured interview. So for the first research question, so what we did essentially was to go into the literature, even though the literature base for this concept is not much, but we took up the little literature that's out there, and we did kind of a systematic review using the exclusion and inclusion criteria. So we used lenses like indigenous evaluation, evaluation adapted to African lifestyle, and we came up with some descriptions. Certain people have described this concept, they've talked about this concept. So we went into the literature base of African evaluation, and we came up with some statements. So these are the 10 statements and where those statements were, gotten from. So for DeFi techniques, if you're not familiar with DeFi techniques, it consists of different iterations of survey and feedback loops. So these are the 10 statements I went in that we started with. So for this is a quadrant, and these are our possible category of statements. So we use this quadrant to rate each statement. For example, in quadrant 1, if a statement is rated I, in other words, it's important. If the mean score is I, it's important to these participants. I mean, our participants, which are African thought leaders in this DeFi study. And if its variance is low, then there's a consensus. For example, there's consensus in quadrant 1. In other words, if a statement falls in quadrant 1, if it has a high mean and a low variance, then the statement is very important. So that is what we did for the first research question. For the second research question, we use the definition that we derived from the first research question as a meta-evaluative lens to go into evaluation reports coming from African evaluation terrain. In other words, we got a report from African Development Bank, we got a report from USAID, evaluation reports, and we use this definition, the central tenet of this definition, as meta-evaluative lens to see if the reports coming out from the continent are reflecting the Made in Africa evaluation concept. So we use 6 evaluation reports purposely selected, and we use the concept mapping, each team concept, that was derived from the consensus definition. A report fits under a team if it demonstrates with evidence the presence of this team, and a report might fit into more than one team. For the third research question, remember I said earlier that Bakele Chidija started working on this concept earlier, and in her research, she came up with 12 actionable items, and she said these are the way forward. These are the next steps for the MAE concept. So what I did for the third research question was to present this statement to my participants who are members of the panel participating in DeFi technique, to rank these statements. So which statement is important to these panelists? And which statements do they consider to be very important among this next step? So this was what they did for the third research question. So for the results now, for the first research question, statements S5, S7, S8, and B3 were considered very important, and consensus was also reached on this statement. So what I did for each statement was to code each statement. For example, S5, conducting evaluation in African setting using localized method tools, data collection methods. The code for that statement is localized method. For statement S7, conducting evaluation with an eye towards promoting African values and worldviews. The code for that is promotion of African values. So what we did was to put together these codes to form, when they are taken together, we came up with a definition of Made in Africa evaluation. Don't forget, it's a DeFi techniques, and these statements were rated by thought leaders who are proven evaluators in the continent. So from the DeFi techniques, we came up with this definition, a consensus definition of Made in Africa evaluation, which is evaluation that is conducted based on African standards using localized methods or approaches with the aim of aligning the evaluation to the lifestyle and the needs of the African people, and also promotes African culture. So this definition make sure this definition encapsulates the 4 tenets or the 4 codes that we previously came up with: the localized methods, promotion of African values, the lifestyle of the people, and African evaluation standards. So this definition captured those 4 central tenets. For the second evaluation question, so we use, like I said earlier, what we did was to use this definition, the central tenets or the central ideas of this definition, as a meta-evaluative lens to look into into reports coming out from the continent. So, for example, if report 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 reflect evaluation standards, report 2, 3, 6 shows that there's evidence of localized methods. In other words, evaluators use localized methods in carrying out the evaluation, that particular evaluation. So report 236 use localized methods. Report 235 says, put into cognizance African values in their evaluation. So this is kind of a concept map where, that captures our result for the second evaluation question. For the third evaluation question that talks about, the panelists ranking the statements that they consider very important as to the next steps for the Made in Africa evaluation. So if you look at this slope graph, we see as statement W4 and W10, which are the yellow and the orange. You can see this is importance and this is feasibility. So this panelist says statement W4, which has the I mean 4.43, and it's also feasible 4.40, and statement W10, which has a very high mean, in other words, it's important 4.29, and it's also feasible 4.29. So statement W4 and statement W10 are considered important and feasible by these thought leaders who are our panelists for this research. So we can back up a little bit and see what statement W4 and statement W10 are all about. So if you look at this, we can see that these panelists are saying that we must fund research on MAE and evaluation that may be used as a test case for MAE. In other words, these thought leaders are saying that we must fund research that reflects Made in Africa evaluation. They consider that very important as to next steps. In other words, in order to mainstream the concept and also see that as very feasible. Also, statement W10, reviewing African guidelines in the light of MAE approach. So they're also saying that the current African Evaluation Association guidelines for evaluation must be reviewed in the light of Made in Africa evaluation. So they consider that very important, that African Evaluation Association must review their guidelines to reflect the concept of Made in Africa evaluation. So that is the third result for the third evaluation question. Now, implication of the research. Evaluator training. To really mainstream the concept, evaluators must be trained or must have a good grasp of African philosophies. In other words, like I said earlier, there are common thread woven through the fabric of the African continent and the culture. These evaluators must be aware of this, and they must learn these African philosophies. Also, beyond technical skills and competencies, evaluators must be trained to be reflexive. In other words, they must be trained to decenter Euro-Western, evaluation mindset and trying to imbibe or inculcate the African evaluation values. So they must be reflexive. In other words, look at the notions that are dominant in their mind that may become a bias in their evaluation. Evaluation practice, review of African guidelines. African Evaluation Association have evaluation guidelines. So these guidelines must be reviewed in the light of Made in Africa evaluation. In other words, these guidelines must reflect the central idea or ideas of Made in Africa evaluation. Also, improvement on professionalization to adhere to high standards. Evaluators applying their trade in Africa must be proven to be professionals. In other words, they must be certified evaluators. So one of the implications of this research is to make sure that the evaluators on applying their trade on African continent are certified. For example, in the case of Canadian Evaluation Association, Canadian Evaluation Society, that have some certified tests to be taken before you become a member of the association, or before you are a certified evaluator in Canada. So this is something that can be emulated by the African Evaluation Association. Also, research on evaluation. One of the things that was found out was that there's need to further research what localized method means. So there's need to look at localized method, what sits underneath localized method. For example, if you are using storytelling as a method, if you are using campfire as a method, if you are using oral history as a method, what sits underneath? In other words, why do we use oral method? Why do we use campfires? Why do we use storytelling? So this is in need of further research. What are the philosophies underpinning these local methods? Also, increased collaboration between scholars, researchers across disciplines. So these are some of the implications of this research. So I would like to hear your thoughts, questions, comments on this before I post my own question. I have some questions written down, but before that, I would like to take questions, comments on this short presentation. You can also type in the chat box if you'd like to do that. Questions? Okay, what are next steps, Sharon? So, like I said, the next steps are two things. In other words, what is considered very important in mainstreaming Made in Africa evaluation. Two things are very important, and they're not just important, they are feasible. So we are not just looking at what is important, we're also looking at what is feasible. So it's important and it's also achievable. So two things are important, statement W4 and W10, which have a I mean on the important side and also I mean on the feasibility side. So what are these two statements I made mention earlier? These statements are funding of Made in Africa evaluation. In other words, there's need to fund research on Made in Africa evaluation in order to make sure that the concept is gaining momentum on the continent. And the second one is W10, which talks about reviewing Africa Evaluation Association guidelines in the light of this concept. So currently the guidelines don't really reflect the MAE concept. So the next step is to make sure that the board of AfrEA, the African Evaluation Association, come together and review their guidelines to make sure that they reflect Made in Africa evaluation. So these are basically the two important and feasible next steps. I'm not sure if I answered your question or if I addressed your question. Any other thoughts? Another question? Sharon, did I address your question? Okay. In the absence of questions, can I ask, let me just try to pose this question to us in the next few minutes. So first question I have here, what are some of the strategies that we use in making sure our work is culturally responsive or contextually relevant? Does anyone want to share with us strategies you've used in the past in your evaluation work to make sure that you are culturally responsive or you are sensitive to context in your evaluation work? Any thought on that? Do you want to speak up? Does anyone want to share with us? And also feel free to type if you still want to ask any question. You want to share with us strategies you've used in the past to make sure your work, incorporates or to make sure your work is culturally relevant or contextually relevant? Or does anyone want to share with us on specific challenges once faced working in a different context and how you navigated such settings? Does anyone want to share challenges, you trying to evaluate a project in a reservation camp, or you go to, any region, maybe here in the United States, where you have a particular set of people that's in that particular context, and you try to make sure that your work aligns with their beliefs and their culture? Or any other contest? It might be a contest that you're not familiar with and you once worked, and what are the challenges you faced and how did you navigate that? Or if you have another question, does anybody want to talk?
Just real quick, I am dabbling in using human-centered design approaches. So going to the end users of whatever if I'm able to go to the end user and to ask questions of, what is important to them in terms of values and what are potential actions or things that could work in their context, is just go directly to them. And I realize those sorts of approaches can't always be used in the various types of evaluations that we do. So it really depends on whether you're in a context where using approaches that go directly to the end user and asking them if this works with you, or how do you feel about that, actually, if it actually allows for that kind of questioning. But that's a way that I've been trying to integrate to try to understand the audience that I'm working with more and more. And this is not specific just to evaluation, but in thinking about developing training or other kinds of activities. Over.
Sounds great. So what's the name?
Sorry?
The name, your name, please.
Human-centered design, HC.
No, I mean your name, so I know who's talking.
Oh, my name, Sue Lin. I'm at Center for Global Health, CDC.
So thanks, so thanks. And that's very, very good. That sounds great. Human-centered approach, going to the end users to, hear from them. That they actually know where the shoe pinches and they know what they need. So that's very good. That's a very good strategy. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts, questions before we round up?
I did have another quick question.
Okay.
Given that it sounds like this research that you've done is emerging, for those of us who are practitioners already working with constituents or grantees in various countries in Africa, are there certain things that you would sort of point us to start thinking about initially, despite the fact that there's more research needed? But are there some actions or things that we can start to think about or try to do as this research is emerging?
Okay, so the one thing that I will say that is important is to be reflexive. In other words, you must engage in reflexivity as an evaluator. So for example, even though I am an African, I was trained in the Western education system where I value some ideas and tenets which are kind of contrary to the African tenets. So the first thing to do is to be reflexive. You know what? Look inward and look at those things that that are dominant and overarching, that are kind of contrary to the values or the culture or the tradition of the context where I'm going to work. So even if you are probably a Westerner going to a non-Western situation, I want to say the first thing to do to, you know, come up, to be contextually relevant and, you know, to be sensitive to the culture of the people is to engage in reflexivity. So challenge some overarching thoughts, opinions that you carry that may want to kind of meditate or go against the culture of the people or the context where the evaluant is located. So that's the first thing I would like to say. So I'm not sure if that's sounds.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So any other thoughts? Questions? Okay, I think we've come to the end of today's journal club. Any final thoughts? Okay, thank you all. Thanks for joining. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. My name is Oladayo Omosa. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.